Daryl Hall just celebrated his birthday this past Wednesday, and I've been really wanting to do a tribute video on Hall Oates, but the reason I didn't get a chance to do this is because, once again, I was banned by just a few administrators on Facebook, apparently, for posting in their groups, and I was banned from doing so for another week. So, any of you out there who might be feeling this way on Facebook, who's seeing this, let me make a deal with you. You don't ban me, I don't report you. How about that? Everybody's at peace. And back to Hall Oates. Trading vinyl, as I've been doing with Scott. He actually provided me with a few of the albums that you're going to see in this list. But I've been experiencing Hall Oates as a musical entity since I was 3 years old in the Bangor Mall. Their song, I Can't Go For That, was actually the first pop music melody and rhythm that I can actually recall moving to and trying to sing to, just in my own memory. And so Hall Oates in the 80s was a very special thing for me, and understanding them as I do now, they were obviously fantastic pop craftsmen who have gotten more overrated over the years. Very much like the Bee Gees, they were played a lot during their heyday. Some would say oversaturated. But looking back on it now, a lot of their songs were not at all what they seem to be, musically and lyrically. And that's one of the themes that I'm going to focus on in this video. Now, to start off with, these are just the 6 Hall Oates albums that I selected because I'm going to focus on their 80s years, which I feel was really their absolute creative and commercial peak. In the late 70s, they had been sort of veering toward the sound that they got with these albums, but they were dancing from producer to producer and still searching out what they were going to be as musical entities. But they decided to do something pretty daring in the beginning of the 80s, and that was to self-produce their next album. They gambled musically, creatively, and they won. And I do mean they won. So we're going to start out right at the beginning of their 80s peak, and that's this album, Voices. Voices is an album that actually came out with 3 very different covers. I believe this is the first variation. There's a similar one in black and white where Daryl's staring out and kind of smiling eerily at the camera. And there's another, which was also used later as a 45 sleeve, of the two standing up, and Daryl is wearing a pink shirt in the picture. And that's the first CD version of this album I had. I had all these on CD, of course, but anyway, the new version comes with both the color and this black and white version on CD, but I wanted to get this one because for some reason I always kind of liked that cover. Voices is a very interesting Hall & Oates album. Now, right off the bat, it included the song Kiss on My List, which is iconic Hall & Oates of the 80s. I don't think I need to discuss its musical virtues. And it was co-written by Jenna Allen, who was the sister of Daryl Hall's creative collaborator and girlfriend, Sarah Allen, of Sarah Smile fame. That song was written for her. And she contributed a lot to that song. And she became a songwriting collaborator, Jenna, that is, during this period. Voices on this vinyl printing is a top-loading album. And I'm going to take that out for you. This album also came with the original inner sleeve, which actually folds out from the side. There are some of the lyrics. And there are some other lyrics. This doesn't have a custom label or anything. But I really love this album. If you love Kiss on My List and You Make My Dreams, Big Kids is another song that kind of goes very well with that. And there's also a song on here called Diddy Doo Wop, I Hear Voices, which is sort of a nominal title song, but at the end of the day, it's still a tribute to the 50s and 60s vocal groups that inspired Hall & Oates, from Philadelphia, Motown, Temptations, that kind of thing. And, of course, they had a cover of the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', which I believe was the first single from this release, or at least the second single, and actually did pretty well from this album. And they also had a early, kind of embryonic version of Every Time You Go Away, which was later covered successfully by Paul Young. But there's a couple anomalies on this album that you don't hear much of these kind of cuts on Hall & Oates' album. And one of them is largely sung by John Oates. And it's the first song that introduces this album, How Does It Feel to Be Back? They'd had an album out every year, you know, since they started in 1972. But yet they wrote a song, How Does It Feel to Be Back? Maybe back commercially, because it's definitely a jangly guitar pop rock song. Has kind of a Heartland flavor, but when it gets to the chorus, you can hear their harmonies and everything. And there's another song on here called Got a Lot of Nerve, which actually has something of a heavy power pop feel. And that power pop feel, you know, permeates the majority of this album. So the Blue-Eyed Soul thing is present on the songs that later became hits, but this is the closest thing from this era of Hall & Oates to a more, I wouldn't say rocky, but more of a guitar rock-ish kind of album. But, you know, I heard it once described as a pop pâtissier, which, you know, actually could describe the music very well. You know, it gets a lot of strands of pop at the time. Power pop, a little bit of a Heartland influence. Some have kind of an almost punky edge, some retro doo-wop, and of course, their classic hits like Kiss on My List and You Make My Dreams both came from this album. Now, when we talk about them really hitting their stride, there's this album, Privatized. This is one of Scott's albums. As he has told me, this album got a little bit, you know, cat damaged. There's Daryl and John tucked in. This album is actually much more uniform in a lot of ways. You know, a lot of the songs sound like they really belong together. It's not as diverse as Voices by any means. And, you know, it was the beginning of Hall & Oates developing a Hall & Oates sound. I know some have called it a formula, but they actually developed a specific sound that worked for them. And I'll get to the name of that sound because it actually applies very well to a title they did for another album, which you'll see here. But, you know, some of my favorite songs on here that aren't the title track, that aren't, you know, I Can't Go For That, are Unguarded Minute, which I first heard as a B-side, and Did It In A Minute, which was a hit I actually saw them perform once on SCTV. And, you know, John Oates did a song on here called Mano a Mano, which stands up wonderfully to that. You know, I'm really beginning to like the John Oates contributions on these albums and warm to his sound. Has a custom label. You're going to be seeing a lot of them in this video because Hall & Oates really became known for their custom labels. Now, in terms of album covers, this is actually one of my favorite Hall & Oates album covers, and I've actually had this on vinyl twice. This came from Scott's collection again. You know, and it starts out with the song Man-Eater. Now, here's where Hall & Oates lyrics weren't what they were said to be. You know, I cracked the internet, read some articles and interviews, and it turns out Man-Eater originally carried very different lyrics and a somewhat more reggae style. You know, Hall & Oates actually intended the song to be about the seedy side of New York at that time. And, you know, they actually changed the lyrics to be more specific to one character. Much the same as I Can't Go For That from the previous album. That song, even though it is ambiguous enough to be about a romantic relationship, it's actually talking about the demands of the record industry and creative independence. And, you know, apparently, you know, Hall & Oates carry these messages off in a very ambiguous way. You know, much the same way that Aretha Franklin, you know, covered Respect. You know, Otis Redding cloaked it in relationship when he wrote it, but, you know, the actual context was more about respect for race, and in her case, sexuality. So Hall & Oates came from that soul tradition of implying things, and it's really interesting to learn that, because to me, these are soul funk guys, you know, giving it a little rock twist. That's how I feel about Hall & Oates. There's the back of that album. This has been used for the front cover in some cases. Maybe it was mispackaged. You open the album up with a top loader. It's got this custom label inside it. I saw some of the people in this band last year on stage at the Bangor Waterfront Pavilion. There's Charles Deschamps, fantastic sax player. G.E. Smith from the Saturday Night Live band for a while, sitting there. T-Bone Woke. There's the H2O. You know, as my friend in the VC, Scott Gallant at Scotty's Record Shop. Big shout out to you, Scotty. I love the pun of this title. Hall and Oates. Water. H2O. This album has an interesting conceptualization. The first side is definitely more straight, you know, soul-oriented, if you want to look at it a certain way. I mean, Crime Pays is actually a straight-up boogie funk number in a lot of ways. And you have One-on-One and Man-Eater, the big hits. Family Man is, if I understand it, actually a cover, but you know what? It's actually not one of my favorite songs by Hall & Oates. It's good, but not what Man-Eater and One-on-One are. Those are just amazingly done. And you know, Jenna Allen, again, contributed a lot to the song Crime Pays, which is another of my favorite. And the second side is actually devoted to more, you know, rock-oriented songs. You know, they have kind of a synth, guitar rock, kind of new wave style to them. So this album, you know, actually finds them getting a little bit punchier and, you know, stripping down the funk and making their rock a little more new wave oriented. Now, remember earlier when I was trying to define what Hall & Oates sound was during this period? This compilation from my boyfriend Scott's collection actually got it exactly right. Rock and soul. That's exactly the way I would describe their sound. It has a rock flavor, but their harmonies and their rhythms definitely maintain that soul. This is the greatest hits compilation released in 1983, and as a lot of these compilations are, the track list is very much out of order, and the version of Wait For Me on here is not the studio version from the album Ecstatic from 1979. It's actually a live version, but the two new songs that are on here are Say It Isn't So and Adult Education, which features Nile Rodgers from Chic. Now, you know, both of those songs were written on the tour for H2O and included on this album. And, you know, the interesting thing about this album, it focuses on the 80s primarily, which is a great period up until this point. But, you know, She's Gone and Rich Girl and Sarah Smile are from their 70s period and are a little bit jarring because Hall & Oates, you know, during the 70s up to the 80s were always evolving and always changing. And it just seems interesting to hear them go from the 70s up to, you know, You Make My Dreams and Man-Eater. It's just a very interesting and sometimes jarring transition. The original CD of this actually used this particular picture for the cover. If you've seen the CD in record shops, you probably know that. Another custom label. The custom labels I noticed in Hall & Oates albums always seem to somehow relate to the covers in terms of their color scheme. They actually had a custom label on their album Along the Red Ledge from '78 too. That was their album from 1983. You know, Hall & Oates had an album from every year in the 80s with some kind of new material on it. Now, the last studio album that defined their big hit days, you know, when they were on fire, was this particular album. And this is a very different kind of album. They call the album Big Bam Boom. And, you know, on the cover, Daryl and John are basically, you know, caught in this graffiti art world. You know, and I would describe this album as an electro, funk, hip-hop-y kind of mixture with their sound. They use a lot of Fairlight and Synclavier synthesizers, and, you know, like with Privatized, it's a very uniform album. All the tracks sound like they were meant to go together. And it starts off with a song that doesn't last too long, but here's a custom label again, kind of a graffiti scheme. Dance on Your Knees, and then it goes right into Out of Touch, which is a wonderful hit in their classic rock and soul style, and then Method of Modern Love, which has a very unusual Caribbean almost jazzy phrasings in parts. One of their more unusual hits. Again, Jenna Allen's involved. You know, R.I.P. Jenna Allen. She was an amazing talent in collaboration. And Some Things Are Better Left Unsaid, which is kind of a poppy number in a lot of ways. But it's all a very uniform album. You know, this also has the big hit, Possession Obsession, which to me goes right along with Out of Touch in terms of a Hall & Oates classic. You know, I can't really go into these songs too specifically because they all flow so well together. You know, people think that they should just buy the Rock and Soul album or Hall & Oates' greatest hits and they have the whole story. I'll tell you something. If you get these on vinyl or on CD or on tape, whatever format you choose, you can put any of these albums on and not be disappointed by any of the tracks. And you might be surprised at what you hear, too. This, even though this isn't a proper Hall & Oates album per se, this kind of caps off their big 80s period. In 1985, they were on a big tour, and they basically got together with David Ruffin and Eddie Kendrick, who's credited without the S there. They later went and recorded as Ruffin and Kendrick, before David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks died, from the Temptations, to do this Hall & Oates Live at the Apollo album. And the first part of it is a medley of Temptations hits, and then they do When Something's Wrong with My Baby and Every Time You Go Away. The second side is I Can't Go For That, One-on-One, Possession Obsession, and Adult Education. And you know, in this setting you hear how soulful these artists are. You know, if you haven't heard it here, I mean, it's hard to believe that, but you know, you see them at the Apollo, you realize these people actually belong in that setting, and that makes total sense for them. The custom label, again, relates directly to the album cover. Well, I'm sure I could have gone into a lot greater detail about some aspects of Hall & Oates' music at this point, and they had albums after this. They had a brief career at Arista, but nothing they ever did or have done since has come to the level of what they achieved during this period. They'd had a very long build-up to it. From 1972, their first album, which was kind of a blip on the radar. Their second album, which had She's Gone, that became a hit a little bit later, building up, you know, Rich Girl, Sarah Smile, you know, It's a Laugh, you know, and Wait For Me, and having that awkward 70s period where they were trying to find their sound and then getting to Voices here. So when I think of Hall & Oates, I think of their sound calcifying and becoming itself here. And I wanted to thank all of you out there on Facebook. Has been a fantastic medium for my videos. I know, again, some of you have chosen to ban me, thinking of my videos and my blog content as advertising and spam for my own personal purposes, but this is how I share my music with you. You know, like I said, Daryl and John here, they took a big chance self-producing with these records and innovating trends in popular music rather than just going along with them, bringing sounds from that era into their own framework. And, you know, that's what I'm trying to do out here, too. I'm trying to innovate and do things. So, you know, I'm not going to compare myself to somebody who wants to be at this level, but, you know, I'm just trying to do in my life, in my world, what Daryl and John did here. And that's actually a good framework for this, because I know Hall & Oates have become a massive thing with a lot of people, and I still feel that way. Because musically, they're part of what defines what I listen to and what I listen for in music. I hear them all over the place. The way they use electric piano, the way they use the organ drum, the bass lines, the sax, everything. Their voices, their harmonies. They're a very big group for me. And if you have these on CD already, or with the bonus tracks, or if you have a greatest hits collection, and you have a turntable, I encourage all of you to go out and beat down the record racks for these albums on vinyl. Because you get custom labels, you get interesting packaging, and they're not really that expensive. I don't think they ever will be. So enjoy your music, and happy belated birthday to Daryl Hall. Peace and love to all of you.